Welcome to Voices from the Other Side. Tonight we open the gate to Alaska's forgotten frontier. 8 bone-cold accounts from ghost towns where the lights went out but the work never stopped. Abandoned mining camps that still ring with steel on stone, deserted rail lines, where a headlamp cuts through empty air. Schoolhouses that dismiss classes long after the last bell. And company stores that tally up winter supplies for customers a century late. These narratives are adapted from first-person testimonies submitted by inspectors, teachers, preservationists, drivers, photographers, and locals who stepped into places the map remembers but the living avoid. To protect the safety and privacy of those witnesses, and the families connected to these sites, names, dates, and identifying details have been altered. Certain locations are generalized or withheld. What you're about to hear is presented as it was experienced by the people who lived it. If you're new here, subscribe to Voices from the Other Side and tap the notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another chapter from America's haunted backcountry. Kill the lights, steady your breathing, and listen closely. The past in Alaska doesn't rest. It whispers. My name is Daniel Hart. I'm a structural engineer licensed in 3 states. The sort of person who gets called when a town wants to know whether a dead building can be coaxed back into the living world. Late last October, I was contracted by the Jericho Township Redevelopment Authority to evaluate an old textile complex everyone just called the Mill. A red brick rectangle the size of a city block, hemmed in by a black canal and a row of maples that had shed their leaves like rust. The bell was gone from the tower. You could see daylight clean through the arched opening where it used to hang. They'd taken it down in the 70s to stop kids from climbing, a councilman told me on the phone. People still swore they heard it sometimes. I don't believe things because people swear. I believe what I can measure. I drove in just after noon, when the cold Pennsylvania sun makes a flat mirror of everything. The main building was late 19th century slow-burn construction. Exterior load-bearing brick, interior forest of hard pine, posts 12 by 14 inches. Floors thick enough that if they caught fire they'd char, and hold rather than flash and fail. Cast iron columns had been retrofitted under a few sagging beams sometime in the 1940. You could read the foundry's name in raised letters around the mushroom capitals. Sawtooth monitors along the roof faced north, originally to drink in even daylight over the weaving floor. The canal along the south wall still smelled faintly of oil and moss. I did what I always do. Hard hat, high vis, steel toes. I clipped a multi-gas meter to my vest, slung a FLIR thermal camera over my shoulder, and carried an aluminum case with a laser distance meter, moisture probe, and a handful of chalk tags for mapping tripping hazards. I photographed every entrance, every crack that might be telling a bigger story, every door that swung too freely because its frame had racked out of square. Pigeons abandoned a hole in the roof when I stepped inside, drumming against daylight. Their wings threw a soft gray snow of dust into the air that hung and glittered in my headlamp, a universe of cotton lint that had outlived the looms. The picking room still had a few hulking machines asleep under tarps. The carding machines had teeth and leather the color of tobacco. In the spinning room, line shafts ran the length of the ceiling, iron pulleys frozen mid-turn, belts rotted to lace. On the main weaving floor, the window rhythm was hypnotic. Tall, narrow brick piers between like ribs. The only color came from a faded safety poster about hearing protection, and a yellowed calendar stuck forever on April. It was quiet in the way of very old spaces. You think it's silence until you notice the tiny chorus, pipes ticking as they equalize with your breath, a drip in the dark, your boot scuff telling you how hollow the floor is. The bell tower was open from the weaving floor by a stair whose treads had been worn concave by a century of legs. Up top, there was nothing but pigeon guano and the square scar where a bell frame had once been bolted to the timbers. I stood in that little brick room looking out across Jericho, the church steeples, the water tower like a little moon, the school football field gone the color of straw. I tried to guess, like I always do, whether the town would really turn this into lofts and shops like the glossy concept renderings suggested, or whether the mill was just a way to park grant money for a year and then quietly let the roof cave. The site plan called for a second day of inspection in the basement and canal works, but the property manager, a man who introduced himself as Clive and smelled like menthols and laundry softener, asked if I'd be comfortable setting up a time-lapse overnight. "You know," said, shrugging, "for vagrants, copper thieves, we don't have security on until next month." He didn't say the other thing, no one ever does first. I said yes because I always say yes to data. I left a pair of small cameras on the weaving floor aimed at the central aisle and the bell stair, and a third halfway down the long corridor of the spinning room. I took my notebook up to the tower to sketch the framing and then back down again. When dusk came, it came all at once, like someone had drawn breath and blown the light out. I ate a sandwich in my truck, logged notes, checked my gas meter, and went back in. The mill at night is a different building. Your headlamp becomes a lie detector. What you thought was a doorway is a shadow. What you thought was a wall is a rectangle of light where a window used to be. My breath came out in pale rope. Somewhere in the north wall, a raccoon or a cat was working on a genealogy. I made myself a little camp on the weaving floor. A folding chair and a thermos of coffee, and a stack of ledger paper. It felt absurd, like ghost hunting dressed as a structural survey. At 11:37 I wrote, ambient 37 degrees F, no wind, no human noise, distant highway. At 11:51 the same. At 11:58 I put my pen down because I thought I heard water moving where the canal meets the intake gate. It was probably nothing. It was always probably nothing. At midnight the bell rang. I don't mean a sound like a bell. I mean the exact harmonic geometry of a cast bronze bell about 40 inches at the mouth, struck with a clapper that hits fractionally high. It came from the tower above me where there was no bell to ring. One heavy stroke that blew through my bones and turned my coffee into a vibration dish. Then a pause. Then 2 strokes spaced. Then 6. Then 3. I was counting without meaning to count, my hand writing numbers by itself in the margin of my notes. The sound did what sound does in big rooms. It found every surface and folded itself back, so the tale carried on like a chant. I stood up and knocked my thermos over. I could feel the tower timbers receiving the blows of something that did not exist. I told myself it was kids, Clive's mythical vagrants, someone with a steel pipe on a column showing off. I took the flashlight and the small mag light from my pocket because if fear is a living thing, it eats contradiction, and 2 lights felt like an argument against it. I didn't make it as far as the bell stair before the other sound started, the machine sound I'd expected never to hear in a building with no power. A long room breath, then an intake, then the polite, monstrous cough of lineshaft bearings taking motion. I don't know if you've ever stood in a room where 50 looms run at once. It's not just noise. It's a fabric of noise. It weaves itself around you until it's the only language. Some part of my brain, the part that catalogs failure modes and stair geometry, kept working. There's no electricity here. There's no pressure in the sprinkler main. There's no way. Another part said, plain as text, look. They came from the far end of the floor, single file down the center aisle, where the maple boards were worn silver. Men and women both in clothes stiff with the style of a century ago. Heavy shoes, wool skirts, sleeves rolled past elbows, hair bound up. Each face held the same expression I've seen on any floor where productivity is measured. Intent without drama, a private conversation behind the eyes. They were not solid. They were more than not solid. They were there the way breaths are there on a January morning. The belts above them turned on pulleys that should have hung slack, and looms began to chatter. The weft shuttles flew. Threads caught light that didn't exist and flashed. What they made unraveled even as it formed. A length of fabric would become itself, and then, at its edge, grow ragged and then thin and then rise away like smoke, pulling apart into separate filaments that lifted and were gone. The foreman. There was a foreman, a man with a vest and a book at his hip, walked the aisle, tapped a loom frame, reached to adjust a tension that his fingers passed through and still changed. I wanted to take a photograph. My body refused. I wanted to move toward them because moving is what you do when you don't understand. My legs decided to be the kind of estimates that err on the safe side and held me where I stood. When one of the women looked up from her station, she met my gaze in a way that made the room seem very small, like there was less air in it than before, like breathing was something you could spend too quickly. Her face was wrong in a way my mind could understand. Not horrifying, not melted or monstrous, just unfinished. The nose and mouth were there and were not. The eyes had pupils that seemed to float on water. Hollow is the word people use, but that suggests absence. This was presence arranged differently. The bell struck again. Not random, not hysteria. The same pattern I had written without knowing why. 1 pause, 2 pause, 6 pause, 3, then a slow, deliberate run of 9, and then, God help me. The blows began to separate not by number but by cadence, like syllables in a list of names. The foreman stopped walking and took his book off his belt and began to read. I don't remember deciding to back up. I found myself with one heel on the lowest stair of the tower, then two, then I was on the landing, and the air up there was colder, as if the bell room had made weather. My phone was in my hand because some other part of me had made a decision my fear would argue with later. I thumbed the voice recorder and held it out into the dark. 12:02, I heard myself whisper. Sequence, 12639. The syllables of my numbers lined up with the blows. Somewhere in the racket of looms, an old song had found a place to hide. I could hear a woman humming the tune you hear when thread runs right. I ran. I didn't sprint because sprinting in a dead mill is a way to break your neck on the end of a cut shaft, but I moved with the kind of ugly speed that makes you a factory for sweat. My light found the exit door, and the night outside was too big for any man. The canal gurgled. The sky had stars. I didn't stop until I was in my truck with all the doors shut, which is the stupidest defense in the world against a sound you can feel in your spine. My hands shook so hard I had to wedge the phone in the cup holder to stop the recorder. The bell kept striking inside the building behind me for 7 minutes. Then the last note went where sound goes when it stops being itself. I sat there a long time with the heater on my face and my fingertips on the steering wheel cooling one by one. People think this is the part where you call someone. The police, the manager, a friend. Instead, I did what my training tells me to do when the world loses its handle. I wrote down the sequence of the bell strokes the way a surveyor writes bearings and distances. I wrote what I had seen in terms that would mean the same thing tomorrow. I wrote the hum in A, how the looms made a beat at exactly the walking speed of a tired person. I wrote, fabric unmaking itself, as if the finished thing is not allowed here. I didn't go back inside. At 4 in the morning, the cameras pinged my phone with full storage alerts, which made me laugh in the back of my throat because it felt like the building telling me it had done its part. At first light, I pulled the cards and packed my tools. Clive asked me from the safety of his day if anything had happened. "It's a big place," I said, and he nodded like I'd told him where the snowdrifts were likely to form. 2 afternoons later, in a room that smelled like crayons and lemon cleaner and old paper, I sat at a table in the Jericho County Historical Society with a woman named June who wore a sweater the color of fresh moss. She had pulled the mill boxes for me, thin gray archival cases with slotted tags and neat handwriting. She seemed delighted by the guest. People don't ask for those boxes much anymore. I asked about fires. She smiled without humor and patted the second box. "If you start in sequence, you'll never finish," she said. "But 1912 is the one people mean when they say the fire." They had a ledger, of course. Mills keep ledgers the way bodies keep scars. This one was water-stained at one corner and smelled faintly of machine oil. A clerk with a great love of lines had made attendance columns for each department. Weavers, spinners, mechanics, pick a room. In ink the color of bruises, someone had made little circles next to names. June told me the circles meant deceased. The mill agent had argued for asterisks but lost. There was a custom, she said, and stood to find a newspaper clipping that had been flattened behind polyester. It was from the Jericho Standard, April 13, 1912. The headline said, in black that still bit the page, "Roll call at the mill." "They brought the bell down to the yard," she said softly, pointing to a photo. "It wouldn't ring true after, but they rang it anyway. The foreman called the departments in the order that work flowed, and the bell tolled. Once for the foreman, twice for the second hand. 6 for the frame minders, 3 for the sweepers, 9 for the mechanics, then a cadence for the rest. Then they read the names. Families knew before the paper did. There are ways a body reacts to confirmation. Mine made my teeth hurt. I slid my notebook across the table. June read what I'd written without any movement in her face and then reached for a pencil that had been sharpened by a nervous person. "You've got the cadence right," she said. "They did that here. The order looks like our order." She didn't ask me how I knew. She didn't ask me if I'd been there. People who work with old things know they are sometimes asked to hold the other end of a rope they can't see. I watched the time lapse when I got back to my apartment. On the weaving floor cameras, there was nothing. I don't mean there was nothing unusual. I mean there was that particular black and white empty between midnight and 12:08, and then my flashlight wobbled into frame and then out again like a nervous comet. On the audio record, though, the little voice memo I had thumbed with shaking hands, the bell rang so clearly I had to turn the volume down, and the background hum was exactly the pitch I'd written. If you scrub through the waveform and mark the peaks, the spacing writes numbers that make a list that looks like a poem and is not. I wrote my report. I wrote about lode paths and settlement. I wrote about the relative integrity of the West Bay versus the East, where damp had crept in from the canal and turned joist pockets into rot you could thumb. I wrote the roof monitors were failing, and that if the town wanted to save anything at all, it would have to be soon and expensive and inconvenient. When I reached the section where I usually talk about site security and nuisance entries, I stopped and stared at the cursor until it pulsed like a heartbeat. Then I wrote, "Recommend temporary reinforcement of bell tower framing prior to any work staging, due to community sensitivity regarding tower and potential for vibration-induced cracking." It was true enough in 3 directions. It would keep people out until winter made a decision the town could not. The next week, driving past Jericho on my way to a stone bridge in need of new spandrel fill, I took the long way to see the mill. A police cruiser idled near the gate, and Clive stood with his hands in his pockets looking at the tower the way men look at their fathers' names on monuments. The air was different, more November in it, or more memory. I rolled down my window. "You hear anything?" I asked, trying to make my voice belong to a man who asks about gutters and not ghosts. He shook his head. "Quiet this week," he said, and for a second he looked relieved and then oddly sad. That night I left my apartment window open an inch, though the forecast said frost. The traffic on my street made its own soft sea. Sometime after midnight I woke from a dream I couldn't keep and lay there listening for something I couldn't name. I thought of how the fabric in the mill had unmade itself as quickly as it came into being, how each thread rose and traveled and went to join invisible company. I thought of the foreman's book hanging on his belt even when belts weren't needed anymore. I thought of the way the bell's last note had gone thinner and thinner until it was a line you could pick up and use to sew things together. If anyone asks me now, in a bar or on a job site, if I believe in that kind of thing, I tell them the truth I can afford. I believe in weight and in resonance, in the way certain shapes hold sound and won't let it die, in the way work carves grooves in a place that are deeper than they look. I believe buildings remember. I believe the past is not behind us so much as around us, textured like brick, waiting for a hand. And if I'm at a window and the hour is clean and still, and a sound comes from nowhere and everywhere at once, I find myself counting before I've decided to count. 1, 2, 6, 3, 9. Then the names, none of which I say out loud. Story 2, the conductor's last ride. My name is Aaron Pike. I'm 32 and I collect things that don't fit in display cases. Switch keys that don't turn anything anymore, schedules for trains that no longer run, and the patience to stand in a field until light and rust agree to be photographed. I'm not a railroader. I'm the kid who never grew out of the sound of wheels on jointed rail. Weekends, I hunt what's left of the old lines across Kansas, trestles chewed by floods, mileposts swallowed by tallgrass, and the derelict roundhouses that used to be the beating heart of little towns. The one outside Abilene isn't on any brochure. A half circle of brick and smoke jacks ringed around a turntable plate that hasn't seen maintenance since before my father was born. 12 stalls, numbers ghosted over their doors. 4 roofs gone, 2 half-caved, the rest holding by habit. The pit is a shallow lake after rain. In October, it's mostly cinders and the bones of weeds. A rusted water crane leans like a drunk just off the shift whistle. If you stand where the hostler would have stood, you can still feel how the whole place was once an instrument designed to move iron and time. I pulled in late on a Friday, when the sun flattens the prairie into a sheet of brass, and even the wind seems tired. I walked the arc of the house with a camera on a strap and a flashlight in a pocket, and the careful feet you learn from stepping across sleeper gaps that might be creosote or might be void. There were inspection pits between rails, ankle breakers if you forgot, a sanding tower skeletal against a faded sky, a little shanty beside the turntable with a door you could open if you didn't mind the smell of mouse and rain. Inside, the handwheel that used to push the bridge around still had finger grease blackened into it, the kind of time you can't wipe off. A thing I do, because I like to be surprised by proof later, is set a tripod and let a camera work while I do. So I placed one in the throat of stall 7, aimed across the table toward the lead, programmed an intervalometer to catch a frame every 30 seconds, and told myself I'd stay through blue hour and into the first stars. The light in these places is better after the day is done. Dust hangs, lines soften, brick remembers. As the sun pulled away, the roundhouse made its night noises. Sheet metal complaining, a small animal making its own graveyard out of a pile of cinders, the long, thin ribbon of interstate sound miles off. Somewhere into full dark, with the Milky Way beginning to show over the blunt horizon, I heard a whistle. Not a distant truck horn that your brain, primed by romance, wants to promote into something nobler. Not a boy on a farm experimenting with a recorder. A steam whistle, low at first, like the prairie clearing its throat. Then the shape of it, a measured human intent pushed through brass and air. It floated without source across tracks that didn't carry anything anymore, bounced off brick and came back changed. I stood very still because motion breaks whatever line is tying you to the reel. Kansas carries sound better than other states. I told myself it was a tourist line I didn't know about, a club of weekend engineers bringing a boiler up somewhere in the Flint Hills, a grain elevator vent playing tricks. Then the wind, such as it was, shifted and the smell came. Coal when it first takes, not yet fully fire, hot cylinder oil, the clean metallic breath of live steam. Anyone who has leaned into a cab on an excursion day knows the difference between museum smell and work smell. This was work. The headlight arrived last. A tight white coin bored into the dark, searching along the old lead toward the turntable that should have been immune to searching. It brightened the weeds into a congregation of tiny bones. It put a shadow of a man on the brick of stall 5, mine, I thought, until the shadow moved when I didn't. A chuff came with the light, the kind you hear from an engine walking, not running. The rails sang the way rails sing when they accept weight. I could see nothing on them, and I could not make myself step back. The turntable bridge, 40 feet of steel that should have been the victim of every winter since 1957, jerked a fraction and then began to rotate. No motor dug up a hum from ground. Nothing touched the handwheel. Gone and returning trees of light walked across the brick as the bridge lined itself to the lead and then stopped clean on a mark only it remembered. He came in easy. A 10-wheeler or a consolidation maybe. I know the silhouettes, not the family trees. Boiler dark against darker, number plate on the smoke box door a small sun. I wanted the number and couldn't have it. It kept bleeding and reforming through the headlight glare. Lettering on the tender washed in and out like something written on water. Men stood in the cab, hats, coats, the half-turn of a body at work, and their presence had the same quality as the locomotive. Not transparent, not there, but assembled of the wrong light. I heard the bell start, polite and insistent, The way yard bells are when you can't see the whole move. He stopped shy of the table and let steam talk for him. The engineer leaned from the window and looked straight down the long throat of the house into my face. There was coal dust on his cheekbone in a place it would be if he'd wiped sweat with the back of a hand. The fireman stood with a slice bar across his shoulder, tired in the knees in the way of men who have fed iron mouths. Between them, on the step, a man in a long coat and a cap with a leather brim lifted his hand palm up in a human motion that has meant the same thing as long as we have been taking rides from strangers. Come on. I didn't move. I couldn't, yes. But also I didn't because something in the gesture had that quality church has when it's honest. It asked and did not ask, offered and did not plead. The man lowered his hand a little and tried again, more specific. He pointed to the ladder up to the footplate. He pointed at me. He nodded once like a friend in a doorway saying there's still room in the car. The whistle gave a small conversational note as if adding a please. It would be easy to invent courage for myself later, to say I stepped forward and felt heat where there was none, to say the iron took my weight and the engine's breath put water in my eyes. The truth is I took one step and the floor of the stall groaned in an old way, and the live portion of my brain that counts risks, even when romance is burning in the other half, told me that a misplaced foot in a dark inspection pit will break both legs and ruin not just an evening but a life. I shook my head because it was the only language I had that felt like a promise to both of us. The man on the step watched me like a teacher watches a child decide whether to jump off a rock into quarry water. When I didn't, he tipped 2 fingers off his brim in thanks or apology and turned. The turntable took the engine and swung it toward stall 3. The bell kept time for a chorus that didn't need it. The men were busy again, the way work reclaims the body even after it has asked for something else. The engine rolled into the stall, the shadow of it folding the bricks into a darker version of themselves. And when the pilot crossed the threshold, it was like watching a film splice. There then not there, like the light that made them had hit the limit of a lens. The steam sound did not die. It stepped into silence as cleanly as a man stepping off a curb. The smell went last, thin, then thinner, then memory. I don't remember bringing the tripod down. I remember the fine tremor in my fingers as I touched the camera, the way the little red tally light reassured like a heartbeat you can see. I sat with my back to a post and tried for a long time not to be poetic. I wrote what I could measure: wind direction negligible, ambient 41 degrees F, intermittent highway noise, whistle audible at 3 levels of amplitude, bell present for 1 minute 48 seconds, turntable rotation approximately 35 degrees clockwise, timing consistent with manual push by 2 men, however no human force observed. Only then did I write: headlight, number plate unreadable, crew present, invitation declined. The frames from stall 7 were useless, or useful if you like the way nothing refuses to be caught. Light changes, yes, a slight rolling blur across 2 minutes where no person moved a camera. A faint column of thicker dark across brick consistent with steam if you are generous to yourself about ghosts. The audio on my phone, a fog of night with 2 clear reads of the bell that pass any skepticism but mine. I didn't go home that night. I drove to a diner with copper mugs hanging over the counter and stayed until the coffee made me shake for other reasons. When the Abilene Public Library opened at 9, I was the first through the door. The librarian who asked what I was looking for had the kind of tireless smile that makes teenagers behave. Local news on microfilm, I said. Rail accidents. Kansas newspapers are stubborn. They outlive their towns. In a back room, next to a laminated map of the Kishome Trail and a display case of arrowheads donated by someone's grandfather, I fed reels into a reader and let whole years spin past in Gray River. It took an hour to reach January 1919. It took minutes to find the page. Frozen trestle gives way on midnight extra. Crew of 6 lost near Cottonwood. There was a photograph, badly reproduced, of a locomotive nose down in a riverbed. Tenders and cars jackknifed behind like toys thrown by a bored god. The number on the round plate was a smudge, but the caption gave me the parts I needed. Engine no. 407 of the Prairie and Western with conductor James L. Harlan aboard, derailed on the Cottonwood River Bridge amid ice and flood. Engineer Thomas Hale, fireman E. Boone, brakemen Kell and Ruiz, and Harlan all perished. All bodies recovered but those of Hale and Harlan. The following day's story was worse. The rescue scene. The watch found in a pocket stopped at 12:17. The conductor's wife named quoted. A detail that went in like a nail. Witnesses at the Abilene Roundhouse report an unscheduled midnight move of no. 407 to the lead. Conductor and crew seen boarding in haste to make up lost time for a winter extra. Yardman states Mr. Harlan stood on the step and waved the hostler to highball. There it was, the coat, the brim, the hand, the language that survives the century. I copied the article by hand because it felt like theft to photograph it. When I got back to the Roundhouse later that week in daylight, I found the same view and put the paper on a post where a man's shoulder would have brushed 100 times going to work. I said the names out loud because no one else was about. It didn't make me feel better. It made a small shift in the air, and that was enough. If there's a moral, I don't own it. I didn't ride when I was asked. Maybe no one ever does. Maybe that's why they keep stopping. Because the last thing that makes a train is not the boiler or the trucks or the rail, but the exchange. The conductor holding out a hand and a human soul taking it. On winter nights now, on the south side of town where the wind is low and clean, I leave a window open a finger's width. And sometimes, once or twice a season, a note of brass comes wandering across the dark. Not a song, just a line. It makes me stand and listen like an animal does when it knows weather is shifting. I count without deciding to. I watch for a coin of light that doesn't belong to the living, and I keep a seat inside myself empty for a man in a long coat who might, in kindness, ask me again. Story 3. The Lanterns of Blackwater Mine. My name is Colin Mercer. I work for the West Virginia Office of Miners' Health, Safety, and Training, and most of my job is counting the ways old holes in the ground can still kill you. Blackwater no. 3 hadn't produced a pound of bituminous since 1954, but a timber company bought the tract last year and wanted to cap the portal before somebody's YouTube channel got them sued. They asked for a state inspection. Gas, ground conditions, any reason not to weld a back gate over the mouth and call it history. I drove up from Charleston on a gray Tuesday in late October, the kind of day when the trees have done their bright dying and the hills look like they've taken one long, tired breath. The mine sat above the Blackwater River, a drift portal cut straight into the hillside, timbers silvered to the color of old bones. The ledger stone over the entry said 1909 in a neat chip chisel script. A slug of cold air flowed out of the mouth like water out of a culvert. The creek below talked to itself the way creeks do when there's nobody around to interrupt. You don't go underground alone. Hank Stover from Tucker County, EMA, met me at the landing with a thermos, a smile you'd trust with your dog, and the kind of quiet that says he's put bodies in bags and doesn't need to prove anything. He'd stay topside with the map and the radio, log my positions and times, and yank like hell on the lifeline if I didn't answer. I signed the entry log on the tailgate of his truck, wrote down the weather, barometric pressure, my intended route. He offered a prayer, I offered my thanks. Gear check is its own liturgy. Hard hat, cap lamp, backup lamp, high-vis jacket, steel toes, knee pads, leather gloves. Dredger multigas clipped on the shoulder strap, O2, CH4, CO, H2S. 2 chemical light sticks on my harness. A CSE SR-100 self-rescuer hung heavy on my belt like a stubborn promise. On my back, a small pack with water, trauma kit, chalk, flagging tape, and a length of line to mark the branch I'd take to the north entries. Fleur thermal camera for curiosity and the occasional raccoon. I bled my lamp into the portal's throat and the rock took it in like a secret. Blackwater 3, Inspector Mercer going underground, I said on the county radio at 1310. Copy, Mercer. Hank came back. I'll ping you every 10. You holler if she don't feel right. The first 100 feet were textbook West Virginia ghost mine. Room and pillar plan chewed out of the Sewickley seam, rib lines white with rock dust that had caked into cakes decades ago, roof bolts orange with 100 wet winters. The track was still there in places, half buried in fines, with crossed eyes rotted down to splinters. A conveyor line hung slack like a dead snake, later addition, abandoned early. Water feathered off the roof where old Brattis cloth had once directed air. The droplets tasted of iron when they found my lip. The only sound was my boots, my breath, and once, a soft, dry rattle that was either a mouse or the memory of one. I stopped at the first crosscut and shot the air with the dredger. O2 at 19, 6%, CH40, H2S0. CO 8 parts per million, higher than I like, but not a sin that gets you sent home yet. I drew a chalk mark on the right rib, date, time, arrow, initials, and spoke the same to the radio as if saying it out loud made it truer. I worked north. The timbers in 2 North were cribbed stout to the eye and rotten to the glove. The kind of wood that looks like you could lean a truck on it until you lean a child on it and it turns to soup. Roof sounded hollow under the pick. Twice I heard a distant thump, roof waiting somewhere deep, maybe a fall in a gob area I'd never see. Twice I told my heart to stay in my chest and my boots to keep a speed that wouldn't trip me into history. At 13:40 Hank checked in and I told him I was at the no. 2 belt tail. Readings are good. Ground's talking but not screaming. Copy, he said. Keep it between the ditches. I don't know the exact foot where the cold changed, but I felt it. Mines make their own weather, and this was a pocket like a basement with the window cracked. My lamp picked up the reflection before my brain named it. Light where there should have been no light. Not the flat white of a LED camp lantern. Not the angry blue of an arc. A warm, animal glow like someone had pressed a jar lantern up behind a curtain. I've spent 15 years telling grown men that light plays tricks underground. That wet coal winks and fools gold fools. I told myself that under my breath and stepped to the mouth of the next entry. Lanterns. Not one. Not a drift of light that could be my lamp double bouncing out of a glossy spot. Half a dozen flames at least, each the size of a thumb knuckle, moving at human pace. They came along the rib in a staggered string, weaving around roof falls and old props, stopping where you'd stop to set a wedge or to spit. The smell came then, late but undeniable, oil and sweat and tobacco stale enough to be memory. The dredger chirped for CO at 12 ppm like it wanted to be part of the conversation. I raised my lamp and found men where the light made them. If you've looked at enough minor portraits, you know the anatomy. Brimmed caps, suspenders over wool, faces gone coal black except where sweat had cut roads from eye to jaw. They swung picks in a rhythm I felt in my own shoulder, a two-beat with a breath laid over it. Dust lifted as it should. The little lamps they carried through wobbling circles that seemed embarrassed by my electric glare. They weren't solid, not gauze, not glass, more like the shape heat makes over a grill. Where their steel met the coal, it made a polite iron-on-rock sound, the old sound that lived before machines. Hey, I called because trespassers get men hurt and I am a deputized busybody. My voice hit the entry and came back wrong shorter, as if the air had thinned to try on another shape. This is the state inspector, I said, tone getting ahead of common sense. Identify yourselves. They kept working. One of them sang, not loud, a low rise and fall that found the place in my chest where lullabies and offertories live. Others answered him in phrases, not English, not anything I owned. You live in this state long enough, you hear church Slavic in coal camps. You hear a funeral in Italian. You hear old men talk to their mothers in Polish after a stroke. This wasn't any of those I could name. The syllables had a lot of air in them, like they'd been shipped dry in sacks and swelled with water. I wrote the word chant in the margin of my notebook without knowing that is what I meant. Mercer, Hank on the radio. You're a minute late on the 10. I'm here, I said. My throat was dry. Just a blockage in 3 north circling. It came out normal. I felt like a child pretending not to bleed. I edged farther, heel feeling for holes beyond the reach of my lamp. The nearest man turned and his eyes took the light and gave it back wrong too much from too far inside. He was 40 or 25 or forever. His mouth moved around a shape that could have been brother in some language that costs teeth. He lifted his hand. Not a warning, not a greeting. A suggestion that I should go the way a man points when a roof is naughty. The roof did more than talk. Somewhere ahead, low and to the left, it made a sound like a wet book closing, a slab of shale coming off the rider. Air pressed briefly past my face, then tugged back like a draft under a door. The dredger went angry, co 68 ppm, then 90. O2 dipped 19, 2 to 18. 9. Methane still kind, but my forearms had goose flesh and my knees had opinions. The men kept working. If the roof fell on them, it fell on them a long time ago, and they were not impressed by my present tense. The chant picked up one voice and then another, the same 9 notes over and over until I wanted to cry because I knew them and I did not. A small lantern hung from a rusted roof bolt began to swing, and its light stuttered across the wall in a pattern like the old tally marks in the office books, 1, 2, 3, 4 /. My feet, which are smarter than my courage, took me back to the crosscut. Coming out, I said on the radio, and only once my voice was steady did I realize I'd made the decision. Roofs waiting in be the no. 3. Air's going sour. Copy and coming to the mouth, Hank said. You got it. I left chalk arrows big enough for a blind man and risked one glance back. The entry was full of men now, filling the room the way a hymn fills a church. Shadows walked where no living body cast them. In the far rib my lamp found a date scrawled in carbide, 3/11/13. I filed it because that is what I do when God talks sideways. I write it down. The mouth of a mine is the best door in the world when you are pointed at it. The river sang louder. The sky had moved toward rain without asking permission. Hank stood under the timbers with that thermos and that face and a question he didn't say out loud. Bad, he asked anyway. Bad enough, I said. CO's creeping. Roof is sulking. We're going to recommend a seal. He nodded like he'd been nodding all his life. You look like you saw something you can't put in a report. I saw exactly what I saw, I said, and he took that answer as the respect it was. There is a trick every inspector learns. When the living facts fit in 2 pages, you go find the dead ones. I went to the county clerk's office, and then the library, and then an old Knights of Columbus hall that the Historical Society had turned into a museum that never loses an argument because it is staffed by grandmothers. Blackwater, no. 3, I said. Early teens, accidents. The woman at the desk wore a sweater with pumpkins on it and knew more than my great-grandfather. We have the pay ledgers, she said, already up. Mass cards, too. She put a stack in front of me that smelled like coal camp soap and incense. In the March 1913 ledger, the names hit me like gravel. Miklos, Stanislaw, Batista, Janik, Kovac, Ruiz, Demko. Next to 7 of them, a circle made in a different hand and a darker ink. Died. Next to the entry for March 12, a note in a clerk's careful English. Fall in 3 North while robbing pillars. 7 killed. Funerals at St. Agnes and Holy Family. A folded clipping from the Blackwater Herald had a headline that would have been sensational if men hadn't died under it. 7 miners lost in collapse. Wives and children mourn. The story read like the mouths of 100 mining towns. The company's sympathy, the priest's Latin, the names and ages, and the line about how the men were of foreign birth and little English. A detail sat there like a key I had dropped hours earlier and just found under the sink. Witnesses report hearing the men singing in their own tongue as they worked to set timbers against a sudden roof weight. The paper quoted the foreman. They had a way of keeping time to ease the fear. It sounded like a prayer. I thought about the lanterns and the tally light on the rib, and the way the chant had fitted itself to my breathing. I thought about how roof rock doesn't care what language you beg in. I went back to the truck and sat a while with my hands on the wheel and the taste of mine air still in my mouth. That copper penny tang a self-rescuer puts on your tongue when you practice, even if you never had to bite down on it. I wrote the report. I wrote about oxygen percentages, carbon monoxide excursions, methane zeros, and why zeros lie. I wrote about the ground, popped bolts, broken timbers, rider coal peeling off like bad wallpaper. I recommended a full seal, block the mouth with concrete, install a regulator if the hydraulics demanded it, put up all the signs the world never reads but the state needs planted. I signed my name and dated it and handed the tidy living part to the timber company in a daytime meeting room that smelled like coffee and carpet glue. The other part, the dead one, I kept. I slipped a photocopy of the ledger page into my notebook. I wrote the names in the margin so I could say them sometimes when nobody could think I was crazy. Miklos, Stanislaw, Batista, Janik, Kovac, Ruiz, Demko. 7 men who came to Asim a century ago because my great-grandfather's machine shop and my father's grocery and my own salary draw a line back to coal like blood to a heart. When I dream, which I try not to, it's not of the fall. It's of that soft, stubborn singing in a language I don't own that somehow knows my breath. It keeps time under the hill where no power runs and no paycheck comes and no supervisor clocks it. I never got to hear their names read in the place they worked. I don't know who would do that now. I know their shift is still turning Inby where the air goes bad, and the lanterns in Blackwater know. 3 will keep their small, living flame for men who learned long ago that the only way through a dark place is together. If you ask me whether I believe in ghosts, I tell you I believe in work that carves grooves in the world and in voices that don't stop because the roof did. I believe the living owe the dead more than a seal and a plaque. And I believe there are songs that keep the roof up a second longer than it wants to be up, which sometimes is all the time a man needs to see another man safely out. Story 4. The Teacher Who Stayed Behind. My name is Elena Brooks. I'm 27, a second-year graduate student in architectural history at Montana State, and I am the kind of person who falls in love with buildings that everybody else forgot. For my thesis, I'm documenting 1-room and 2-room schoolhouses across the High Plains, how they were sited, heated, lit, and loved, before the wind folds them into the prairie. The building that took me the longest time to find sits 3 miles off a county road in the Judith Basin, at the end of a 2-track that looks more like a decision than a path. Locals call it Red Willow School, even though there is not a single willow within a day's walk. I met the caretaker, a retired rancher named Earl, at the gate. He handed me a ring of keys so heavy it could anchor a skiff and said, "You know the bell's long gone. County sent it to the museum in Great Falls back in, 82? Kids kept climbing the tower." He paused, like there were other reasons he didn't care to say. "Second floor's soft in spots. Keep your weight over the joists and for the love of God don't lean on the banister. It'll act like your friend until it isn't." The November light was the color of old straw. A northerly pushed at my coat and the grass bowed without argument. The schoolhouse was 2 stories of weathered clapboard, 8 tall windows on each side, a small vestibule with pegs where generations had hung coats and wet mittens. The belfry rose above the front gable like a square white crown, empty. The blank circle where the bell had once hung made the sky feel closer than it should. I took out my notebook and wrote the first line I always write: date, time, temperature, wind, from habit, and then the lines I only write when a building seems to be holding its breath. Inside was the smell I love most in the world. Old varnish, chalk, paper dried to brittle sweetness, dust that isn't just dirt but years. 2 classrooms, one on either side of a narrow hallway, each with a blackboard running the width of the front wall and rows of double desks with iron legs lacy as cast fences. A stage at the end of the right-hand room. The assembly space, the winter plays. The 8th grade graduation still wore a faded banner. We salute our boys, the kind you see in photographs from the 1940s. A world map with the Soviet Union in that big, improbable color hung near the piano. Someone had once tacked a Christmas star over the teacher's desk and never took it down. I do buildings the way some people do birds. I set a camera with an intervalometer at the back of each room, wide lenses aimed toward the front, to catch changes in light, and, if I'm lucky, motes of history the eye can't hold. I looped a thin safety line around the newel post and my waist before testing the stairs, like Earl had taught me. I slid a small audio recorder onto the ledge just under the empty belfry because even silence can be a document. My field kit was the usual. DSLR, spare batteries tucked into a wool hat so they wouldn't die, a laser measure, a moisture meter, graphite sticks for rubbings, a roll of butcher paper to catch a full-sized impression of the tin ceiling pattern. You learn to move slow. Houses speak more when you don't rush them. I worked until the light thinned from honey to water. At 3:47 p.m., while I was tracing the profile of a window casing on butcher paper, a sound came through the building that every cell in my body recognized before my mind could argue. The school bell rang. It was not imagination's substitute, not a truck downshifting on the county road, not a far-off windmill and wishful thinking. It came from above and inside, a hammered bronze tone that rolled down the stairwell and across the varnished floors and into my sternum. One peal, round and clean, then a pause, then two shorter strokes, a breath space between, and then another single note. The pattern was muscle memory I didn't know I had. 3 short, 2 long. The end-of-day signal every country teacher used to use. I stood very still, pencil held an inch above paper, and my skin rose in 1,000 small hills as if the air had just turned to frost. "Got it," I whispered for no one. I switched on the audio recorder in my pocket, though the other one near the belfry was already running. When you are a historian, you learn to collect the thing before you decide what the thing is. At 3:49, I heard chairs move. No one will believe how ordinary the sound was. The gentle scrape of wood on wood, like dozens of small apologies occurring at once. Paper rustling. Children trying to be quiet and failing in familiar ways. I turned toward the left-hand classroom because that's where the noise was thickest, and stopped in the doorway with my hand on the jamb because everything in me knew there was a line you don't cross unless you mean it. There were children, 20, maybe 30. You want me to say they were fog or light, but they weren't. They were new to that room the way your own reflection is new every morning, present in a way that doesn't require permission. A boy of 8 in short trousers and a sweater with the elbows gone shiny pulled a wool cap from a peg that hadn't been there 5 minutes before. 2 girls in dresses of the same printed calico, sisters or cousins, tied each other's scarves. A high school boy, farm tall, shoulders already knowing a chore, picked up a music book from the piano, slid his fingers along the keys and made no sound, then smiled in the way of someone who always tries things twice. Their boots carried a little chill with them, like they'd been left on a back stoop in January. They had the clothes I've studied in photographs. Cotton stockings darned not by a mother, but by the wearer herself, patched jackets that carried the neatness of pride if not money, boys' hair cut at home by Bowles and sisters. You could tell where home was by what they carried. Lunch pails of tin, a book tied with a strap, a slate stacked with figures and the ghost of a handprint. The air in the room changed, as if someone had opened a small door in the side of the day and winter stepped through. At the front of the room stood a woman who looked like every good teacher and exactly like herself. 35, maybe 40. Dark hair pinned into scents, skirt sensible to the weather, white blouse with the cuffs rolled once because chalk is patient but dust is ambitious. She had the voice that carries across a room without ever cutting anyone, and she used it now, not to command but to end a day. "Wrap up your arithmetic, please," she said. Her eyes lifted and found me as if she'd been waiting. Remember your readers. We'll begin in Prairie Song tomorrow, and I'll be very cross if I hear any complaints about long vowels. Her students made the agreeable noises of children who intend to forget. As they passed me, a few looked up and smiled the frank Montana smile that makes a stranger feel useful. One little girl, hair in 2 braids, a red knitted hat held in her hands like something precious because it was, stopped and tugged at my sleeve. "Are you the new teacher?" she asked. Her voice sounded like it had come a long way but wasn't tired yet. Miss Wallace said someone might help with the older grades. I opened my mouth to say no. I am a historian, not a teacher. I grade in coffee shops, and the worst thing that happens if I am careless is a citation error and a sigh. I began, and then Miss Wallace was beside us. The kindness in her face was not softness. The best teachers are steel wrapped in velvet, and she was that. She took the little girl's hand and looked at me as though we'd been introduced once at church and she couldn't quite place the name. "They've come back," she said. "They come back every night the wind remembers." She glanced toward the hall, toward the door, toward the world that had no business nearby. "We have kept going as best we can. Will you take over their lessons?" That is the sentence I carried back to my car like a coal you don't want to go out. Not will you visit, not will you sit, not will you tell our story, but will you take over their lessons? The weight of it was a ledger and a promise and the sound of a pencil held correctly between small fingers. I do not know what expression moved across my face, but Miss Wallace seemed to see it and tilt hers in answer. "It isn't as much as it sounds," she said. "It is exactly as much as it sounds." The bell rang again, 3 short and 2 long. The children filed out into an afternoon that was not the one I had walked into. Their boots made no mark in the dust of the vestibule. Their laughter was ordinary, and therefore the most unbearable thing I have ever heard. Miss Wallace was the last to leave. On the landing, she stopped beside me and smoothed the front of her skirt as if to gather herself into the person children deserve. "Bundle up," she said softly, and the sorrow in her eyes was not for herself. When she stepped through the doorway, the world folded into itself the way a curtain finds the wall. I stood in a long hush. The clock on the right-hand wall had stopped at 3:56 sometime around 1969 and hadn't noticed anything since. It offered no counsel. My cameras made their small mechanical breaths. Outside, a cloud that had been ragged a moment before seemed stitched together. I told myself to do what I had come to do. I measured room widths. I traced one more molding profile. I climbed the stairs and retrieved the audio recorder from the ledge under the empty belfry with hands steadier than I deserved. By the time I locked the door behind me, the wind had changed its mind and brought snow. I drove back to town with the heat on full, and my coat still buttoned and my mind in the place where facts have their first arguments. I didn't say what I had seen to Earl when I returned his keys under the hardware store neon and thanked him for the warning about the banister. He nodded in that way old men do that says they are allowing you your own timing. The next morning I went to the county courthouse. It is a handsome building in a small town, which is one of the ways Montana tells the truth about itself. The clerk, a woman with a sweater full of pins shaped like animals, asked what I needed, and when I said school records, she sighed happily and led me to a wall of boxes that had not been opened enough. The box I wanted knew I would choose it. Red Willow School, 1946-1952. Inside, attendance ledgers in a careful hand. The kind of careful that sits up straight and believes in being fair. A note about a new stove installed January 1949. A bill of lading for coal. A letter from a mother apologizing for her son's absence during lambing. And then, a folder with 3 documents that made the room change size. The first was a clipped article from the Judith Basin Herald, dated February 3, 1949. Blizzard traps Red Willow School. All safe overnight. It read, in the kind of optimism newspapers put in type when they are still allowed to hope. The story described children kept at the school when a sudden whiteout made the road impossible. Miss Margaret Wallace writing notes to parents on a school tablet and sending 2 older boys to carry them down the draw until they were forced back by wind. The second clipping was the next day's. Faulty furnace flue blamed in school tragedy. Teacher and 23 pupils lost. It named them, as small-town papers always do, boys and girls across 3 grades, the youngest 6, the oldest 13, a sentence I can still recite. Miss Wallace reportedly kept the children together in the assembly room, singing to keep spirits up as the storm raged. By morning, all were gone to God. The third document was a photograph, badly printed on wartime paper, of a group of children on the Red Willow steps in their best clothes, arranged by height the way teachers have arranged children since the invention of cameras. Miss Wallace standing behind them with a smile that is steel and velvet. On the back, in a hand that shook but refused illegibility, someone had written the names. I read them all. Then I read them again. I spent the afternoon at the museum in Great Falls because that is where Earl said the bell had gone. It was there, polished and too bright, with a new rope and a placard that said, Red Willow School, 1906-1949. I stood beside it and tried to be practical. Bronze has a memory. Sound finds ways to continue in a world made of molecules. None of that is what happened. I pressed the audio recorder's earbud into mine and played yesterday's file. You can hear the wind, the pages of my notebook, the muffled scratch of my pencil. And at 3:47, clear as a truth you owe someone, the bell. I went back once more to Red Willow before the county sealed it against the winter. The snow was already thigh-deep in the swales, and the light was short, and a hawk watched me from a fence post like a question. I stood on the steps and read the names I had copied from the back of the photograph. One by one, first names only, because that is how a teacher says them. I promised nothing. I took no vows. I am not Miss Wallace, and I am not brave enough to be who she asked for. But I stood in the doorway between the warm place and the cold, and I said, "Class dismissed." And for the first time in my life, those words hurt. If you ask me what I believe, I will tell you I believe in buildings that keep time differently than we do. I believe in bells that can ring from far places because some jobs don't end just because the mechanism does. I believe in women who hold children together with singing. And I believe that on the prairie, in certain afternoons when the wind remembers its lines, there is a schoolhouse where the day isn't over yet, and a teacher who stayed behind to make sure of it. Story 5, The Bride of Deadwood. My name is Mara Quinn, and I make a living out of other people's yesterdays. I own a little shop in Rapid City called Black Hills Relics, glass cases of tintypes and belt buckles, trunks that still smell faintly of cedar, and the occasional miracle that pays 2 months' rent. I tell myself I'm a historian who happens to issue receipts, but that's a story with a price tag. Truth is, I go where the map fades. Old claims and near ghost towns scattered along the back roads of South Dakota, and I listen for the rooms that haven't finished talking. Last September, with the tourists thinning and the cottonwoods going the color of whiskey, I drove the Spearfish Canyon Scenic Byway before turning onto a nameless Forest Service road that crawled along a creek. My destination wasn't Deadwood proper, but one of its satellites, Galena, a mining camp that never quite decided whether it wanted to live. A friend tipped me to a boarding house at the edge of town that was due to be condemned, the kind of place where the landlord simply locked the door when the ore ran out and let weather write the rest. The porch had lost its argument with gravity. The front steps held, but only because they hadn't gotten the news. Inside, the air was a layered cake of dust, floorboards, wallpaper roses gone to ghosts, the faint sweetness of old starch. I did my usual sweep, kitchen, parlor, back rooms, tapping drawers with a knuckle, listening for the hollow note of a hidden compartment. In the bedroom at the top of the stairs, a wardrobe waited the way a stage waits for a curtain. A full-height armoire of quarter-sawn oak with a beveled mirror and a key still in the lock. You don't force something like that. I warmed the key between my palms, turned it as if it might be listening, and opened both doors at once. The dress did not belong to the room, and yet belonged to it more than anything I had ever seen. Ivory silk taffeta, hand-finished seams, a bodice stiffened with whalebone and patience, seed pearls sewn into a lattice so fine it made my eyes ache. The skirt fell in a bell of fabric that seemed to drink the dim light and give it back softer. Veil of Brussels lace, gloves tucked inside as if the bride had set them there for a moment, just a moment, before pulling them on. If you handle enough 19th century silk, you learn to expect grief. Weighted silk is the term. Dyers added metallic salts to make flimsy fabric feel expensive, and the metal eats the silk from the inside out until it shatters if you look at it wrong. But this dress, the silk was springy under my glove. The seams sang but did not sob. No yellowing, no stain, no moth-slow murder. It was wrong the way a miracle is wrong. I carry acid-free tissue in my kit, a garment bag, and a camera because you don't trust memory where money is involved. I set the camera on the dresser, a mirrorless body with a 50mm prime, and took a few test shots, adjusting exposure to fight the gloom. When I lifted the dress from the hanger, it weighed almost nothing, a suggestion of a garment. I laughed out loud then, some mix of relief and glee, and the sound startled a bird in the eaves that I hadn't known was there. I laid the dress across the bedspread, smoothed the skirt with the back of my hand, and raised the camera again. She was already there in the viewfinder. A young woman in her early 20s, hair darker than the silk and coiled in the fashion of the 1890s, stood at the edge of the frame as if she had stepped into the light to see what I was doing. The gown fit her as if made yesterday, the bodice cupping her breath, the skirt sighing against the floorboards. Her eyes were too bright in that old way, the way of someone being brave for the sake of other people. One gloved hand rested at her waist, the other held the veil's edge with the care you give to something borrowed. I lowered the camera. The room was a room, dress, bed, wallpaper, light. I raised the camera. She was closer now, her face turned toward me with a question I didn't yet know how to hear. I don't scare easily. Antique dealers get used to places where the present is a visitor. But my breath went small in my chest. "Hello," I said, because it was either that or run. She did not speak. Her chin lifted, and she moved as if remembering how, one step then another, the beginning of a waltz without a partner. The skirt turned with her, a pale tide folding and unfolding at her ankles. Through the viewfinder, I watched her mouth tremble, and tears that did not quite behave like tears gather and spill, not staining the silk, not falling to the floor, simply unmaking themselves when they had told their truth. 3 beats, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, traced across the room in a slow circle. I realized then that I could hear music, not melody but time, the hush of a bow over strings played at a great distance, not for the living. I photographed because I didn't know what else to do. The camera's whisper felt like an intrusion and an offering at once. When I tried to look without the lens, she was gone. The dress lay where I had placed it, innocent, impossible. My hands had started to shake enough that I needed to sit, so I sat on the trunk at the foot of the bed and did the thing I do when confronted with what I cannot account for. I wrote, date, time, light conditions, fabric notes, stitch count on the bodice seams. The phrase appears only in viewfinder. The sentence subject weeps and waltzes alone, and lower because I am not proud, I am afraid. Night comes early on roads that have forgotten how to be roads. I packed the dress the way one wraps an heirloom, acid-free tissue between every fold, veil flat, gloves placed like a prayer, and carried it to the truck without letting it touch the hallway walls. Back in my workshop in Rapid City under the clean light, the dress looked exactly as it had in that bedroom. Perfect. I put on cotton gloves and examined the seams for clues, a maker's mark, a seamstress's signature in basting thread, a place where a nerve had twitched and left itself behind. Then I photographed it again. If a person wants to believe in rational things, it is best not to keep photographic proof of irrational ones. She appeared again as soon as I raised the camera, a soft superimposition on the world I thought I knew. Sometimes she was beside the dress, eyes closed as if listening for a step that never came. Sometimes she looked straight into the lens, and I had the uncanny sensation that I was the one being documented. Once she lifted both hands to her face, the way you do when the news arrives too late to change anything. Once, only once, she smiled, a small, fragile lift at the corner of her mouth that made me want to leave the room and bring back something worth giving. For 3 days, she kept to the edge of the frame. I stopped sleeping well. I caught myself speaking out loud as I moved around the workshop. "You're safe," I said, "and I'll be careful, and once, I'm sorry." I began to feel like a thief who had not yet admitted to herself what she had stolen. Research helps, even when it can't save you. At the Adams Museum in Deadwood, I asked for marriage announcements from the 1890s and obituaries from the same. The volunteer behind the desk, blue cardigan, a brooch shaped like a thistle, pulled a drawer of index cards and then a roll of Pioneer Times microfilm, and set me up with a machine that smelled like dust and electricity. On the January 1893 frame, I found it. Miss Clara Whitcomb to wed Mr. Thomas Bell Saturday next. A paragraph of small-town joy. The reception planned at the boarding house on Church Street, the bride's gown described as a confection of silk and lace. The groom a junior partner at the livery. On the very next week's paper, another notice. Miss Whitcomb succumbs to influenza. The word grip in a sentence that should have been about flowers. The wedding, postponed upon account of the bride's illness, will now be replaced by services at the Methodist Church. The last line was a kind of ruin. Mr. Bell, prostrate with grief, asks only for prayers. There was a photograph tucked into a church ledger. Do not ask me how such accidents happen, only be grateful they do. Of a young woman standing on a boarding house porch in the winter sun, her hand shading her eyes. Someone had written Clara on the back in pencil that had learned to be careful. I pressed my palm against the glass of the reader and let my forehead rest for a moment against the cool edge of the machine. The dress in my workshop had found its owner, or the other way around. I didn't list the gown for sale. I didn't call the Seattle collector who would have wired money first and asked provenance later. I didn't do any of the things people assume dealers always do. I waited for a day with clear roads, packed the dress in its garment bag, set the camera on top with the lens cap off because honesty matters, and drove back to Galena. The boarding house met me with its own patience. Upstairs, the bedroom felt like a breath held in a chest you didn't know was yours. I opened the wardrobe and found the hangers exactly as I had left them. I lifted the dress from the bag, and for a moment I thought it lifted itself, just a fraction, a shaving of air. I hung it where it had hung before. I placed the veil on the shelf and the gloves in the right-hand drawer. I smoothed the skirt and stepped back because it felt like the right thing to do. In the camera, she stood in front of the wardrobe, hands folded at her waist. No tears now, no smile, a stillness so complete it felt like a kind of music. I did not lift a hand in greeting or goodbye for fear of asking for more than I deserved. I only stood and tried to make my breathing quiet. "Thank you," someone whispered. It came from nowhere and everywhere, through the camera, from behind me, from the edge of the window where the light went thin. The syllables were air on the back of my neck, not a voice I could identify, not a trick of old wood settling and making people of itself. The dress shifted then, a small settling such as fabric does when it remembers itself on a hanger, and the room let out the breath it had been holding. I left the wardrobe doors open. I locked the front door behind me. On the porch, I stood with the strap of the empty garment bag cutting a bright line across my shoulder and looked at the hills. They were the same hills the bride had looked at. They were not the same. Back in Rapid City, I made a folder called Clara on my hard drive and moved the photographs there. I didn't delete them. I also didn't show them to anyone, which is unusual for a person who believes in the currency of proof. The veil of Brussels lace might still be there in that wardrobe, and it might not. If you go with good hands. I sell a lot of things that never belong to me. Some leave me happily. Some step across the threshold with a backward look. Every now and then, though, I carry something I am not meant to keep. When that happens, my job isn't to turn a profit. It's to put the thing back where it belongs and close the door softly behind me. In Deadwood country, in a bedroom that learned to hold winter, a dress waits that has already been worn as far as it needed to be. And if you ever hear, very softly, a woman say thank you, don't be afraid. It isn't for you. It's for the leaving. Story 6. The company store of Bodie. I'm not the first guy to haul boxes into places that haven't had a mailing address in 100 years, but it still feels wrong to punch Bodie, California into the dispatch tablet and get a green check mark back. My name's Evan Cruz, 35, route driver for Sierra Hall and supply out of Bishop. Most days it's diesel, dog food, roofing felt, and enough canned soup to withstand 3 Sierra storms. Once in a while, though, an order shows up that makes the guys in the warehouse whistle and say, "You sure that's not a prank?" This one hit my queue in late October. 10 cases of canned goods, 2 tarps, wool blankets, kerosene lamps, lamp oil, nails, flour, sugar, salt pork, winter staples packed neat. Paid up front with a cashier's check that cleared. Phone number disconnected. Delivery location, Boone Store, Bodie. Note on the manifest, if closed, leave at counter. The Boone store is the old general store the state kept in arrested decay. I've taken the tour like everybody else. Does great business in postcards. Doesn't do actual business. Company policy, my supervisor said when I asked if this was a Halloween joke. Attempt delivery. If it's a bust, bring it back and we'll sort it out. So I loaded the pallet, signed the clipboard, and headed north on 395 under a sky that looked like someone's knuckles. At the Bodie Road turnoff, the wind developed opinions. The last 3 miles of washboard dirt rattled my fillings and the boxes in back. And when the state park came into view, a scatter of buildings frozen mid-breath at 8,000 feet, a stamp mill's bones biting the ridge. I felt that old, quiet awe. You look at Bodie and you can still hear the cash drawers, the fights, the pianos banging out something optimistic in a key they never learned. The entrance booth was closed for the season. Gates swung open. A sign asked visitors not to enter buildings, not to take anything, not to leave anything. I had a manifest that said leave at counter. I parked on the main street where the false fronts slouched like old men at a bar. The Boone store and warehouse sat 2 doors down. Weathered clapboard, big plate glass windows filmed with dust the color of tea, gold leaf letters faded to a whisper. Through the glass I could make out shelves lined with goods gone to museum petrified. Tins whose labels remembered their colors. Shoes with paper still stuffed in the toes. The key to delivering to the past is to act like it ordered. I dollied 3 boxes at a time to the front porch, shoulder bumping the door with each load. It was supposed to be locked, of course. It wasn't. The latch gave with a civilized click and the door creaked inward into a cold, preserved smell. Old wood, dry paper, iron. I stepped across the threshold half expecting a ranger to materialize and write me a ticket. Afternoon, a man said in a calm storekeeper's baritone. I didn't scream, I admit to a grunt. The man stood behind the counter, hand resting on a ledger the size of a Bible. He wore a white shirt with sleeve garters, a dark vest, and a mustache of the kind you only grow if you were born before the invention of distraction. His hair was neatly parted. A brass scale sat to his right. A glass case of penny candy that had been petrified since before my grandmother was born sat to his left and somehow looked fresher. "You found us," he said, as if I'd been expected all day. "God bless you for it. The pass'll lock up early this year. You've got the lamp oil." I said because that was the first thing my brain could find. Yes, lamp oil, blankets, flour, a dozen other things. Sierra Hall and Supply. Delivery for the Boone store. Just set him there if you please. His gaze flicked to the manifest. "We settled up last week when I sent the order. Cashier's check." "That's right. Then it's proper you take the balance in hand." He opened a drawer and pulled out a packet of bills wrapped in a thin ribbon. The paper looked new in the way nothing in Bodie ever looks new, thick and fibrous, the ink deep and complicated. He untied the ribbon and counted with the unshowy speed of someone who had done this a few thousand times. 2 10s, 4 5s, he said, and slid them across the counter. The numbers and portraits, whoever they were, floated on engraving so fine it made my eyes itch. The blue treasury seal shone like a lake in shade. Series 1912, it said in small letters an engraver had loved too much. "You're open?" I asked, because the alternative was "What are you?" "We're here," he said, which was not the same answer at all. "Familes'll be in directly." As if cued by a timekeeper I couldn't see, the bell over the door chimed, and 3 people entered with the purposeful air of shoppers who know a storm's coming. A woman in a wool coat the color of oatmeal, her hair pinned under a hat with a small, serious feather. 2 children, a boy of about 9 with a newsboy cap and a girl perhaps 7 in a red scarf. Their boots carried in a little cold and something like the smell of coal smoke. The woman touched 2 fingers to the brim of her hat toward the storekeeper like a habit and moved to the bolts of cloth. 5 yards of the blue calico, Mr. Boone, she said, and the flour you set aside for us. Yes, ma'am, he said, taking up his pencil. On your account, Mrs. Jorgensen, if you would. She glanced at me in my neon safety vest and did not look surprised, the way you don't look surprised at weather. More customers followed. A bearded man in a Mackinaw chose nails by the pound and talked about repairing sledge runners before freeze-up. An older couple selected lamp chimneys and a new stovepipe elbow. A teenage boy hefted a sack of oats like pride. The room filled at an ordinary pace with a past that hadn't gotten the memo, and the strangest thing about it was how quickly it felt ordinary to me too. They didn't flicker. They didn't walk through walls. They moved around me with the casual choreography of people who know where everything is. I started unloading boxes in a mechanical rhythm because if you stop moving, that's when your mind tries to make sense of it. The storekeeper, Mr. Boone, apparently, removed the lids, inspected contents, and stowed things on shelves that had been waiting for exactly this moment for a century. He recorded each item in the ledger, date, quantity, cost, in tidy, canted script. You'll be careful going back, he said at one point, not looking up from the book. The grade's a devil after sundown. I will, I said. Do you, want me to take a signature? He smiled, the faintest tilt. We settle our accounts properly. He slid the ribbon-wrapped packet closer until my gloved fingers could reach. Best you be along before dark. On the way out, I almost ran into a man coming in tall, shoulders bent by a job that doesn't let you stand up inside, hat brim snow damp. He tipped it to me like he recognized a fellow laborer. Mr. Boone, he said over my shoulder, put the sugar on our chit if you please. I'll settle after payday. It's settled when I write it, Boone said, pencil traveling the page like a train that had never broken down. But I write it because you'll settle. Out on the porch, the wind made the boards complain. I stacked the last of the empties in the truck, climbed into the cab, and sat there with the engine off and my hands on the wheel and the packet of bills on my thigh. I told myself to start the truck. I started the truck. In the rear view, the Boone store's windows held nothing but my own taillights and 2 dusty rubies. Back in Bishop, I did not tell the guys at the warehouse anything. I showered, sat on the edge of the bed, dried off, and drove to my bank just before closing, because that was the only thing in the world that felt like a measurement. The teller, college kid, pink tie, flattened one of the 5s on the counter and stared like he just found a fish in a glove compartment. He said, where did you get this? It came in on a job, I said. He waved a supervisor over. The supervisor, who had a face like a cheerful anvil, didn't touch the note until he'd put on cotton gloves. He turned it under the light, sniffed it. Bankers do that, checked the watermark, checked the engraving. It's real, he said finally, eyebrows doing discreet calisthenics. Small size, large note, blue seal. We haven't seen one of these Treasury retired this design a century ago. He glanced at me as if I'd just walked in with a mastodon tooth and a sincere expression. We'll have to send them out for verification and redemption, but yeah, they're good. I left with a receipt and the hum in my chest that shows up when the night part of the world says hello in the daytime. The next week, the deposit hit exactly as if I had walked in with 20s from the gas station. Nobody from the Secret Service knocked on my door. My supervisor sent me an email asking if I wanted to run the Mono Lake route on Friday. Business continued to be business. 2 weeks later, a new order hit the tablet. Address the same. List a little different, more nails, more lamp chimneys, a coil of rope, 3 sacks of beans. I reassigned it to Nate, a new guy who thinks nothing in the world can surprise him because nothing in the world has yet. When he came back, he mentioned the delivery had been weird, the customer super old-fashioned, and the cash like movie money, but the bank took it. He shrugged. People up their play at the past, I guess. I could have corrected him. I didn't. There are places where the ledger isn't done. Bodie is one. The sign at the park says Arrested Decay, which is a neat phrase for a museum brochure, and a poor description of a town that still keeps house when the wind turns. I know what a crisp bill feels like. I know the weight of a winter order in my arms. I know the exact tone of a shopkeeper's voice when the season's edge is coming down the grade. And I know the way a doorbell sounds when you step into a store that shouldn't be open and is. If you ever find yourself on that road, if the sky looks like a fist and the sagebrush hisses against your tires, if you happen to be carrying something people used to need and still do, you might try the Boone Store's latch. If it opens, don't panic. Put the boxes on the counter. Take only what you're owed. And when you leave, count the change with your eyes before you count it with your fingers. The present spends just fine, but every now and then it makes room for a little leftover currency from the part of time that doesn't close. Story 7. The Builders of Iditarod. My name is Elias Norton. I'm 41, a field preservationist for the Alaska Heritage Trust, and I spend more winters than summers working where roads quit pretending to be roads. In November, the bush pilot set me down on a crusted lake 2 miles from the ruins of Iditarod and promised to be back in March, weather and common sense permitting. He throttled away into a sky the color of a bruise. The valley swallowed the noise and left me with a sled of supplies, a radio that could reach no one, and a long wooden season. Iditarod is Gold Rush shorthand for a vanished city. In 1910, it rose out of spruce and muskeg, a sacrament to speculation. Hotels and saloons, assay offices, warehouses, a courthouse with a flag that cracked in the wind so smartly you could calendar your day by it. Then the easy gold went thin. A fire took the rest, and by 1930, the town had done what towns do when money leaves. It went looking for itself somewhere else. What's left sits low in the land. Foundation stones like molars, scattered timbers gnawed by weather, a handful of buildings that fall with dignity a little more each year. The trust calls what we do stabilization, which is the polite way to say we keep structures from dying all at once. I set up in the old boarding house, 2 stories of stubborn, roof half-patched, windows tinned, a Franklin stove with smoke opinions. My routine was daylight work and ledger nights. In the brief midwinter light, I flagged perimeters, shored a wall here, braced a sill there, staked orange tape around holes that wanted to be invited. After dark, when the cold made the boards complain, I drew elevations and sorted hardware in coffee cans. Cut nails in one, square spikes in another, screws that didn't belong to this century in a third. I wrote dates on everything because time is a better thief than I am a keeper. The first odd thing happened after the first real snow. I woke to a world made new, 3 inches of hoar-frosted silence, and stepped out with a mug to watch the sun saunter up an hour late. The boarding house stoop wore a pure white sheet. The street, what had been Front Street, lay blank as unlined paper. And there, crisp as a photograph, and where no one living had any business being, a set of footprints crossed the open square. Boots, not modern tread, heels with a cat's tongue texture, soles smooth with a faint diamond where a cobbler had stamped pride. They came from the south, skirted the framing of the burned-out hotel, and then did something impossible. They climbed onto a foundation where no steps existed, traveled the air 6 feet, and continued as if a floor had been there all along. I followed them, of course I did, past the old livery, around the stump of the Northern Lights saloon. They wandered the bones of the main street and then stopped dead at the threshold of a building that no longer stood. No turn, no scuff, no doubled print, just stopped. There were other tracks by afternoon. Smaller boots in parallel 2 then 3 sets, one with a toe worn to a tilt, appeared around the assay office foundation. They came and went as if the walls were suggestions and the doorway still held hinges. I set trail cameras at the logical angles. That night, armed with a thermos, I sat by the window and smelled someone else's smoke in a town that had none. The second odd thing was how my tools moved. I keep a tidy line, not because I'm fussy, but because a neat kit has saved me more fingers than I care to count. One night I set a crosscut saw and a box of wedges on the bench, wrote it in my notebook, habit. I inventory myself, and went to sleep to the creature noises of the stove. In the morning the saw was on the floor, teeth away, wedges fanned as if someone had sorted sizes by eye and the right hand. Chalk marks had appeared on a 2x10 I'd milled, clean carpenter's notation, a triangle for a brace, a tick for this side out, an arrow at the end grain. The marks did not match mine. I took photographs. I drew them again just to be certain they weren't mine. By dusk the board had been slid closer to the door. I made tests to satisfy the part of myself that insists on tests even when the answer is already sitting in the room. I tamped a fresh rectangle of snow in front of the old hotel site and set 4 carpenter's squares at the corners like a cheap ritual. I lined a sill plate with shavings, each curl set at 11 o'clock. I turned a full sweep of screws half a turn out of their holes and registered their slots in my notebook, all vertical. I set a string line across the gap where the barroom floor had been, and then I waited. At 2:17 a.m., the world woke to a sound I have known all my life, a hammer finding a nail. Not the careless ringing of modern speed, but the particular, heavy persuasion of someone who does not waste blows. The sound came from 3 places at once, to my left and my right and somewhere before me where the hotel had been. Behind the sound was the murmur of coordinated work, the saw's hush when it turns from crosscut to finish, the small grunt and slide as a beam is urged into a pocket, the impatient shuffle a man makes when he holds a post, and the brace is late. I stood in the doorway in my long johns and socks and watched breath frost itself in front of me like a curtain. The square of snow I had tamped lay pocked with prints, the carpenter's squares knocked to weird angles. The string line had fallen and drawn a diagonal the way a plum would if you asked it which way the world leans. You want me to say I saw them right then? I didn't. Not fully. I saw motion at the edge of motion, denser dark in a room that had no room. Something carried a beam across emptiness with the logic work uses to cross gaps. Something raised a frame where wind has been walking for 90 years and held it until something else told it yes. The hammering worked in conversational time. Tap, 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 hush, tap, tap, spoke to itself, paused to listen, resumed. An hour, two. At 4:03, as if by a time clock I could not see, the sound drained out of the street. The footprints remained. The string line lay caught against a frozen knot in the sill. My shavings had been disturbed into purposeful chaos. After that, I stopped proposing reasons and started showing respect. I tidied, labeled, left notes like the kind of man who leaves coffee for a night watchman he's never met. I wrote on a scrap and tacked it where the hotel foyer should have been 100 winters ago. Braces cut. Tenons marked. Take if needed. E.N. At midnight, I crouched at the window and pretended to study my own breath while trying to watch without watching. I slept in my coat and boots and kept my hat at hand. I was not afraid. I was something better than afraid. I was responsible. The first clear sight came under moon so thin the stars did most of the light's work. I had laminated my shutters with plastic to keep the worst of the wind out. It made the window a mirror. In the reflection, the ruins of Iditarod became a busy place. Men, dozen, then 2 dozen, moved with the exact efficiency of people who have done this together long enough to speak in nods. Their clothing carried the logic of a camp where money was time and time was weather. Wool over wool, caps pulled to brows, mitts cut away at the fingers for grip, boots that had been resoled until soles ran out of ways to forgive. They were not transparent, not the play of cloud and hope. They were gray in the way of shadow that takes on shape. Their faces were working faces, a jaw clenched around a nail, a mouth pursed for the effort of lifting, shoulders rolled under weight. They brought lumber that existed only for them and yet measured true against my tape. They set a header in a doorway that confession and plank had not shared in living memory. They squared a window opening, scribed for a sill, and brought a saw to the line with a patience not taught and not forgotten. And they weren't alone. A woman in a long coat and scarf, hair tucked like propriety, walked a slow route among them and checked a list. She looked at the brace I had left, ran her hand down the grain as if to feel what tree and time had conspired to make, and nodded toward the saloon as if the frame there deserved it more. A boy who could not have been more than 15 shouldered a bundle of lath that would have broken my back and did not hurry about it. An older man, iron whiskers, eyes that had been wind-polished until they learned to ignore it, stopped at the edge of the old sidewalk and looked up at the space where the hotel sign had once hung. He raised his hands like a man catching memory, set them, and for a breath I could read it, Northern Star. I stepped out slowly, a supplicant not to ghosts but to work. The cold pressed its coin to my teeth. I stood no closer than a customer might stand when men are laying out a long beam and requested nothing with my posture. It did not matter. They saw me because the world, on nights like that, allows a certain overlap of concerns. One of them, mid-40s maybe, hard to tell in light that belonged to other folks, caught my eye and touched the brim of his cap. Not formal, not a flourish, courtesy. He pointed at the brace I'd left and then at the corner where the dining room had been. I nodded because yes, that's where it wanted to go. He smiled, slight, the kind of smile a man learns after a life of seeing the joke and not always telling it, and turned to the work he'd meant to do before I showed up with my soft hands and borrowed lumber. I watched him set the brace with 3 blows, so exact they taught the wood a lesson. Something loosened in my chest then, and the only way I can say it is this. I had misnamed what I was keeping company with. I had come to catalog a haunting. What I was witnessing was a shift. They did not curse or joke or sing, at least not in air I could hear, but they communicated in every other way a crew does. Chin lifts, syllables abbreviated to fingers, a tap to indicate a quarter inch, a palm flat to stop, a lantern lifted to ask for light. They worked out of memory's inventory, and their materials obeyed a physics I do not, but the geometry was ours. Rise and run, plumb and level, nails where nails belong and pegs where pegs do better. I recognized the joinery not because I had built it, but because I had spent my life saving it. Just before dawn, while the stars were deciding whether to stay late, they gathered themselves. It happened the way a tide turns. No single moment of reversal, just the sure retreat of motion. And then absence where presence had been so complete you feel foolish for doubting what your own eyes learned. The brace stood for a heartbeat with no frame to carry, then eased into itself, aboard again. The header rested on posts that did not exist and became length and width without intention. The men went out of the air like men coming off a shift, one by one, with a last check of pockets, hammer, pencil, twine, before stepping toward that other place crews go when clocks tell them to. They made normal noises, stove ravens, the groan of wood remembering it is wood. The snow recorded what happened without knowing what it had recorded. Boot prints led to edges, stood, then faded into the lies of sun. I walked the site with a tape and a notebook, and the numbers smiled. An 8'10" header where the old receipt called for 1. A window width that matched a long burned sash I'd measured in July. The brace angle that anyone taught by a patient boss would have chosen. I wrote 2 reports that winter. One was the kind we file. Condition assessments, photographs, recommendations that begin with stabilize and end with where funding allows. That report sits in a state server alongside 1,000 others. The other report I wrote with a pencil on paper and placed in a waterproof envelope under the boarding house floorboards, because I could not decide whether it belonged to the trust or to the people I worked with overnight. In March, the pilot brought the world back to the lake with a wing wag and a hand out the window, the way a man wave saws a 2x4 and calls it good. We loaded up my sled and I looked down the street one last time. The hotel's bones were still ghosts. The saloon's foundation waited as it had waited. The air was the air. But the measure of the place had changed, not in boards standing or roofs returned, but in the knowledge that labor does not always stop because a ledger closes. Call it a haunting if it lets you sleep. I call it a crew on the night shift. Men and women who cannot be talked out of the work that made their town real once and will not be permitted to vanish entirely now. They are not here to scare or accuse. They are here to put a brace where a brace belongs and to carry beams across spaces only they can feel. If you go there in winter and hear what sounds like someone swinging a hammer to a rhythm they learned from their grandfather, do not be afraid. Someone is repairing the world in a place that remembers how. And if you leave a board, mark your tenons clearly and plane your edges true. They have standards. Story 8. The Forbidden Map of Chisana. My name is Daniel Pike. I'm a geologist by training and a metal detector rat by choice. The kind of person who spends weekdays staring at thin sections of schist under a microscope and weekends listening to a threshold hum in places no one visits on purpose. Late August, with the tundra just beginning to rust at the edges, I chartered a bush flight into a remote drainage east of Chisana, the last brief gold rush of Alaska, carrying a 6-inch coil, a compact tent, and the kind of optimism you only admit to when the prop is already idling. From the air, the valley was a braided mathematics of water and willows, pale threads crossing and recrossing over gravel bars that looked like dragon scales. The pilot set us down on a cobble beach where the creek braided itself thin, handed me a satellite beacon, shook my hand like we were exchanging a dare, and lifted off into a sky glazed with blue smoke from distant fires. Sound left and the valley filled with nothing. I stood next to my duffel and listened to it. Chisana's stories are stuck to every timber up here. 1913, gold whispers. 1914, men arrive by the hundreds. 1915, winter and reality. Cabins sag in the willow like old men in chairs. Rocker boxes rot into their own shadows. Sluice boards lie where floods forgot them. The ground keeps what it can. Boot tacks, harmonica reeds. 44-40 casings. Brass tags stamped with numbers that meant a man's little pile of hope. I camped above the high water line, pegged guy lines with stones, and walked the old traces until my ears remembered how to hear faint signals. Midday, on a bench above the creek where a line of spruce had the stubborn look of men who had seen wind and chosen to remain unimpressed, the detector gave me a sweet, tight warble, not ferrous trash. I broke the surface with my entrenching tool, moss, duff, a shallow layer of silt, and saw the rusted rim of a small tin. Coffee, 100 years of earth trying to make it honest. I pried it loose, wiped the lid with my sleeve, and felt the delicate give of a century-old seal giving up. Inside, a cigar tin. Inside that, oilskin. Inside that, a rolled sheaf that bit my gloves with the crispness of paper made to last. The map was hand-drawn and professional, the penmanship of someone who had been paid to make other men believe in ground they had not yet seen. Contour lines snaked like ribs. Creeks were named where no one names creeks anymore. Survey bearings hung in the margins like secret promises. The name in the corner in precise block letters, E.L. Hart, Sept. 1914. And in two places in a different hand that cut the page like a warning flare in red ink that had outlived its maker, "Do not dig here." Below one of them, smaller, "Voices at night." By the other, uglier, "Kavanagh and J. Miller lost, Oct. 15. I don't believe in omens. I do believe in people leaving themselves instructions when they don't have time to leave explanations. The red letters woke up something in me that felt like sense and curiosity fighting in a stairwell. I told myself I would only go to the first site, just look, just see if there was any sign. Then I packed the detector, the map, a roll of flagging tape, and a little extra water and followed Hart's neat bearings east along the creek, over a low col, and into a side valley cut in a straight, mean line by something that didn't care what ran across it. The geology improved as the sky clouded. Rust-colored gossan streaked the slopes where sulfides had come to die. Quartz stringers stitched the schist in veins as wide as books. I broke a fragment with my rock hammer and smelled a ghost of garlic, arsenopyrite. The detector chattered a little at old square nails, a horseshoe, a flattened tin cup. I flagged the map's coordinates with tape, set a grid with twine and stakes, and began to sweep. At first, the finds were the usual, and I took comfort in the usual. Boot eyelets, a brass suspender buckle that still bore a few threads, the bent tongue of a harmonica, A small brass tag stamped 42 that had once stood for a claim or a bunk number or a man's place in a ledger. Then the signals began to cluster around one corner of the grid. Flat, solid tones with a little tail at the end that said something substantial, something buried a long time. I opened a test pit the way you open a book you're not sure you want to finish, slowly with care for the binding. 3 feet down I found the first bone. Not fossilized, not ancient, pale, in soil that had kept secrets by freezing them. A radius, then a femur, then phalanges curled like a question. Some were broken like accident, spiral fractures, edges worn by time. Others were broken like anger, shattered, splintered, forced. I told myself a collapsed adit can do this. I told myself 100 pounds of timber can do anything it wants to the soft architecture of a man. Then I found 2 vertebrae laid at right angles to each other, and my brain stopped arguing with itself and started listening. By the time the light had slanted toward gray, and a cold breath had started traveling up the drainage, I had uncovered enough to know this wasn't a single misfortune. There were at least 5 individuals, maybe more. A boot lay crumpled on its side, the leather unstitched by rot, the hobnails that had once held a man upright bright as fish scales. A tobacco tin, dented. A folding knife with a bone handle. I had the thought that if I put everything back exactly as it had been, the ground might forgive me for prying. But daylight is a debt that runs out, and the valley was beginning its quiet work of pushing me toward camp. The first sound came when I zipped the pit under my tarp and turned toward my tent. A low tremor underfoot, the kind you feel in your teeth before your ears, like someone dragging a piano across stone in a room below your feet. Then a pause, then again closer. I went very still because stillness is the only thing that lets you tell the difference between wind and something else. The sound sharpened into a pattern. Scrape, pause, exhale. Scrape, pause, exhale. If you have ever been underground when ventilation fails for 5 seconds and returns, you know the feeling your chest makes when the air has to be borrowed from somewhere else. That feeling stood beside me in the dusk like a companion who had not asked to be invited. I told myself the valley breathes. Permafrost heaves and sighs, drainage channels open and close, roots crack and knit. I said those things out loud, not to convince the night, but to fix my voice to something human. Then the ground just beyond my flagged grid lifted. Not collapse, emergence. The soil rose in a dome and broke along a neat line, and from that line a hand came up, pale as fish belly and ridged like a root system that had learned to move. I stood there and my breath did something that was not breathing. The hand wasn't a hand except it was. 5 digits. Nails that had become tools. Scars the color of old iron looping the knuckles. It gripped the edge of the pit I had made and pulled, and a forearm followed. Translucent skin drawn so tight it showed a map of something moving under it with the pulse of a very slow machine. Then a shoulder, then a head. The face was wrong in the way that makes you recognize the thing it used to be. Cheekbones a little too sharp, jaw a little too wide, eye sockets enlarged as if light had become an offense. Hair only as a memory. The mouth opened and I saw teeth that had been asked to do jobs they were not designed for. Behind the first one, more shapes moved, not a swarm, not a rush, a procession of purpose. They didn't come for me, they came for the pit. 4, 5, 6 of them emerged, each carrying the earth as if it were as light as breath. They slid into the hole and began to work, and I use the word work because nothing else fits. They placed bones with a tenderness that broke something in me. Vertebra to vertebra, femur to pelvis, hands arranged so the fingers were not alone. They found the brass tag stamped 42 and set it on a breastbone with care I recognized from every burial that ever meant anything to the living. One of them lifted the battered boot and pressed it against an ankle until the leather remembered how to be shoe. They were fast but not hurried, efficient but not indifferent. And as they worked, the ground itself seemed to move with them, soil sliding into place as if grateful to be told what it was supposed to do. One of them, taller, with a scar that forked from ear to collarbone like lightning, rose from the pit and looked at me. I have worked mines long enough to know the look men give you when you have just done something stupid that will hurt you if not corrected. It was that look, minus everything human except intention. "You shouldn't have dug here," it said. The voice was like air passing through gravel, a hiss you could mistake for wind until it arranged itself into words. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. My hands went cold to the elbows. "I didn't know," I said, which was both the truth and not. The map had said the thing it could say. I had wanted my own answer. "Some gold costs too much," it said, and the word struck something in me that had nothing to do with money. In its face, I keep calling it it's because I don't have the right to call it he. Something changed. The eyes, black as wet stone, flicked past me to the creek, to the slope, to the flags I had set, to the tarp I had staked over a grave I had made out of curiosity. The jaw set in a way I recognized from 1,000 supervisors who pointed at a safety violation and then at their watch. "Go," it said, not a threat, a dismissal. I went, not in a panic, not in a run, because the only thing worse than running around bears is running around the unknown. I walked backward until the grid was a geometry in the near dark, and the figures in it were shapes against deeper shape. In my periphery, other mounds of earth rose and subsided like breathing. The valley made a sound I had never heard it make, like a gopher field multiplied by 100 and sped to human time. By the time I reached my tent, my hands had remembered how to shake. I did not sleep. The valley worked in the night, and I tried not to listen too hard to the sound of tunnels marketing themselves under my feet. Around 3 in the morning, the sound softened, the way a crew softens when the shift ends and the last nails have been driven and the last wheelbarrow dumped and the last list checked. At dawn, frost filmed every surface. The grid was gone. Where my pit had been, the ground lay level and undisturbed, the tarp folded neatly on top with my stakes coiled inside it. The brass tag 42 was gone. The boot prints I had made walking backward had been flanked by sets of marks that were almost boot prints and almost not. I packed because I didn't know what else to do that would not be disrespect. The map went back in the oilskin. The oilskin went in the cigar tin. The cigar tin went in my pack, and every move felt like a theft. I cut down my flagging tape as I walked out, and the little orange knots fell into my palm like apologies. I left my spare batteries in a dry niche under a spruce and didn't leave a note to explain why. Back in Fairbanks, I took the map out twice and put it back twice. I dreamed about tunnels and woke with dirt in the crease of my elbows that wasn't there. I wrote a report that said nothing and filed it nowhere. When a friend asked if I'd found anything, I told him about the harmonica reed and the suspender buckle and the boot tacks, and he said, "Cool." And we drank beers like the world is entirely ordinary. I have not returned to that drainage. If you press me for coordinates, I will tell you I lost the map, and that will be a lie in service of something truer. 110 years ago, a man named E.L. Hart wrote "Do not dig here" in a hand that was as precise as anything I have seen. I did not listen. Someone else had to come fix what I started. I do not know what those beings are. Transformed minors, as my brain insists on naming them. Something the ground invented to correct us. A biology I am unqualified to even imagine. I only know the tone of a foreman's voice when he says go and means it kindly, and I know the weight of a warning that outlives the man who wrote it. If you ever walk a Chisana side valley and the willows stand back like spectators, and the ground feels hollow under the gravel like a breath being held, and if you find a neat red "do not dig here" on a piece of paper no one has any business finding, believe it. Some gold costs too much. Some graves refill themselves. And some stories aren't yours to finish.